Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with James Bradley, the author of Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. He's written for The Village Voice and Newsday and is the co-editor of the Martin Van Buren Papers. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Bradley.
Thank you, Evan. Nice to be with you.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Our first 7 presidents all did things before the country was founded to warrant their rise in politics. Washington was a general, if not the general. Adams spearheaded the Declaration. Jefferson wrote the Declaration. Madison wrote the Constitution. Monroe was a soldier in the Revolutionary War and served in the Continental Congress. John Quincy Adams had an obvious built-in advantage. Nepotism is nice, I guess, but he also served as a young diplomat. And Andrew Jackson was a young prisoner of war. But Martin Van Buren became the first president to be born of the new nation. He didn't take public office until 20 years after the nation was founded. He would be the first and not the last president to rely on politics to advance his station in life. So, James, what made him a natural-born politician?
It all had to do with his upbringing. He was born in Kinderhook, New York. This is about 20 miles south of Albany. It's what we generally call the Hudson Valley. And as you noted, he was the first president not born a British subject. And he made the cut by only a couple of days. It was only a few days before he was born that diplomats in Paris signed the preliminary articles of the Treaty of Paris. So he comes into this world a native of the new nation. And at the same time, there was all this political turmoil taking place in his particular region of the world. This area, this part of New York, was overall sympathetic to the rebellion, but his town of Kinderhook was not. It was largely a loyalist stronghold, and his father's tavern was his father was a patriot, capital P patriot, meaning he was in favor of the revolution. And his tavern was sort of used as a meeting house for revolutionary and patriot activities. So Van Buren grew up in this highly charged political environment where he was dealing with the fallout from the Revolutionary War. And what was going on in Kinderhook was that they were trying to search for ways to how to sort of heal these rifts that were very, very deep-seated. I mean, families never spoke to each other ever again. A lot of people were imprisoned. They had to flee the country because they wanted America to remain part of Great Britain. There was tremendous tension going on. So Van Buren learned at an early age the art of politics, the art of compromise. How you sort of bring people together and try to form a government based on mutual trust, mutual self-interest. And at the same time, he's in this area. He lives off the post road where people are constantly traveling and stopping in his father's tavern and they're spending the night. There have long been rumors that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Aaron Burr stopped there. We don't really have any hard evidence for this, but it's a nice thought anyway. We still know that there was.
They would have stopped there if they were riding by on their horse, let's say.
Yeah, right. He grows up in this highly charged political environment, so it's almost like the stage was set for him, and he just really gravitated toward this world very much, and it never left him.
Before we go on, I do want to mention that AxelbankHistory.com, which was just launched, was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Check her work out. The website has our most recent episodes on it. It has featured episodes and also the link to that Patreon page. There is a Seinfeld episode, which I'm sure you're familiar with by now.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Kramer unwittingly flashes the number 8 at a group of street toughs and declares himself an honorary member of the Van B Boys, the street gang. fictional street gang. It's not based on anything. The joke works because most might know the name from a poster or something, or from going through a book of the presidents, but almost no one knows anything about Martin Van Buren. How did that happen? Even though the political system that we live under was born under his style of operating.
It's because he was an unsuccessful president. He becomes president in 1837. He succeeds Andrew Jackson, and he has a miserable 4 years in office. And on top of that, historians have lumped him in with all of these antebellum one-term presidents who failed to halt the nation's descent into civil war. So he's put into this category along with Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. So we have this perception that he is one of the forgettable presidents, somebody not really worth studying. And it's true to an extent. He was a forgettable president. There are great lessons we
That's
can
gotta
learn
hurt
from.
coming from you. I mean,
Right,
my
but
goodness.
his presidency was not a successful one. Nevertheless, we can learn great things from it. And the story of his life, as I make clear in my book, is not that he was a great president who deserves reappraisal for his 4 years in office. It's that he changed America's political culture. He took these ideas that were kind of in development at the time. Political parties, do we embrace them? Do we shun them? Do we find a way to work them into our larger body politic? Van Buren was enthusiastic that yes, in order for us to have a functioning democracy, in order for us to have people who are engaged and passionate in the system, we need to have a mass political party, not Federalists and Democratic Republicans like Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, where gentlemen met in a room together and worked out compromises. An election where citizens are engaged. And you keep them engaged by getting them involved in the party and by promising them some jobs down the road. It's in their economic self-interest to be involved in the party. And through that economic self-interest, they become more informed about the issues. And all of this will lead to a more functioning democracy. Now, whether this worked is something I think it's debatable, and we can debate this, but nevertheless, the mass party is a reality. And I think Martin Van Buren, more than any other politician from his era, brought this about. And I think that's really the great story of his life.
Interesting to think about the fact that he wasn't president until almost 50 years after Washington took office. Describe for us what the expectation was for political parties during that time, and what the parties did, and then how they worked before Van Buren became a force.
Okay, before Van Buren became a force, we lived in a system that historians like to call the system of deference, meaning ordinary people are really not to be that engaged in the process. That politics is a practice for gentlemen to be involved in, men of property and standing and education and breeding. Many were lawyers, merchants, professionals of some sort or another. And of course, you had to own property. And if you owned property, well, then you could be elected as an elector and you could participate in the electoral college, which voted for president. The idea that what they called the unwashed and the unlettered back in the day, the people with no, proper background would have a say in who's elected representative or leader of the country. It was really just a distant concept. But things started to gradually break down. There was this understanding that what kind of country are we going to have if we're only going to let elites have a say in who runs it? And one of the great catalyst moments was the War of 1812, when people came back from the War of 1812 fighting for their country, and they were shut out from the political process. And they found out that they had a lot to say because, especially in this region of upstate New York, people left for a while to fight. No one was paying their rent while they were gone. They'd come back. Landlords would hand them a nice invoice saying, you owe me a couple of years of back rent right now, which they didn't have. This had a real galvanizing effect in New York politics. And Van Buren seized on this to break down property requirements for voting in New York. This happened gradually throughout the country. So this transition from a system of deference to a system of democracy took place over several decades. And Van Buren, along with others, but he was the one who I think was the real driving force in harnessing that new voter energy and trying to build a mass party through that.
Describe a little bit more of his childhood. This is someone who I think is super interesting, is bilingual. He spoke Dutch as a child, learned English later on. His first language wasn't English, which I find
Well,
interesting.
we're not quite sure of that, Evan. I get into a lot of trouble. I never thought I would get into a lot of trouble saying this, but you would be surprised.
You
Letters
won't
I
get any
get.
trouble with me. That's why you're here, by
I
the way.
get
Yeah.
letters. I get letters in the mail. I'm not kidding you, from people saying, "How dare you say Dutch was not Van Buren's first language?" I'm a little skeptical of this because his family had been in New York for 5 generations when he was born. Uh, Kinderhook had already lost a lot of its Dutch flavor. There was more migration from New England. Many people who are English, Scots Irish were living there now. I think what's more likely is his parents knew Dutch. They spoke it around the house. He picked it up. He could probably converse in it, things like that. But this idea that Dutch was his first
Mhm.
language and he learned English later, that's been asserted in a lot of history books, 19th century history books, but I've never found any hard evidence for that. And I'm also an editor of the Van Buren Papers, and I have not found one word of Dutch in any of his letters, and I've read thousands of them.
That
And
seems pretty significant.
as have all my colleagues at the Van Buren Papers. So, but there's no question that he grew up in a kind of polyglot, multilingual society. And, this whole connection to the old world that was still very strong is something that I think informed him.
Did he sense early on, the way a Bill Clinton might have or Richard Nixon might have, that politics could take him somewhere? Or was he kind of discovering this field early on, that it could be for somebody who was not born of fantastic wealth?
Oh, very much so. That he learned at an early age, and a lot of this was through, I think, his mother's guidance and encouragement. Family of 8, 5 boys, all of them became lawyers. One was a congressman, his half brother, James Van Allen. The others had joined local positions in New York. And of course, Martin Van Buren becomes president of the United States. This was a period where lawyers who were previously there to serve the wealthy increasingly became part of the larger social order. It started during the revolution when they were kind of working on behalf of the rebellion. And in Van Buren's time, lawyers were learning how to be engaged in politics as well as their profession, and how to use the law to increase suffrage, to come to the aid of farmers, tenants, and artisans, as opposed to the landed gentry, the corporations, the banks, which is what lawyers were previously doing. So at a very early age, again, Van Buren was in this highly charged political environment to begin with. He uses his law career as kind of a springboard to get involved in politics, and he starts at the very local level. His first elected office was Kinderhook fence viewer in 1806. It sounds quaint, it sounds funny, but it was actually an important position because the fence viewer was somebody who adjudicated boundary disputes. What happened was there would be a lot of flooding in the spring, and a lot of the flooding the fences would fall down, animals would scatter everywhere, neighbors started bickering, and then Martin Van Buren had to come in and find a solution. So this was great training when he later becomes the Columbia County surrogate. Then he becomes a state senator. So this
And you meet
understanding,
a lot of people that way too. You're going house to
you
house. Yeah.
meet a lot of people, and these are people who are, of course, at the most vulnerable moments of their lives. When a loved one dies, people were dying intestate all the times. They didn't have wills. Van Buren had to find a way to come to the aid of widows and other people who had lost a loved one, and how their assets would be distributed and determined. These were the issues that shaped people's lives forever. So he learned at an early age about the importance of property, and how to take that knowledge of his and had to find a way of building a political career around it.
This is an aside, but when did the position of fence viewer dissolve into the ether? Who was the last fence viewer?
You know, you've stumped me, Evan. I don't know.
uh, I love asking authors about how they put their books together and what that got them interested in their books. And this is the time we're going to do that here. I want to ask, first of all, I'm guessing the first time you heard his name was not the Seinfeld episode.
I'm a little too old for that. But
Yeah, right. Do you remember the first time you heard his name, or when you decided you were interested in him?
You're forcing me to get into some embarrassing personal history here right now.
I hope it's not too
When
embarrassing.
I was a pup, my grandmother got me American Heritage books for my birthday one year, and American Heritage was this. You know, we're trying to find the right words for it right here, but it was
Like a
sort of.
periodical or an encyclopedia or
Well,
something?
I
Yeah.
would. It was not the periodical. There was the American Heritage books of the presidents, and there were 12 volumes of them, and I just devoured them. And for a lot of kids, and for a lot of history in the post-war era was something that really grew to unprecedented levels of popularity. That's what led to the kind of explosion of history professors and majors and so on after World War II. My grandparents wanted to sort of extend that to me, and I became really fascinated with the presidents. And they even got me these little figurines of presidents that I used to have scattered around the house, and I still have them. Do I have any here? I think they're tucked away
It's a great habit as long as you don't talk to them, right? As long as you don't. Yeah.
So this sort of when I was in third grade at show and tell class, I was sent to the front of the class and I rattled off all the presidents in 45 seconds or something like that, and made me very popular with my classmates. Let me tell you. So that interest was always there. Now, as for Van Buren, I always thought that he was such a fascinating figure, and he was always lurking. You see his name in so many history books, like Arthur Schlesinger's The Age of Jackson, and even up to more recent times with Sean Wilentze's The Rise of American Democracy and Daniel Walker Howe's What Hath God Wrought. He was always there in these books, and I just thought he's a key figure. And in my opinion, even though there have been some good biographies written of him, I don't think there's one that ever really captured the whole scope and panorama of his life. And I wanted to begin with the Dutch family coming here in the 1630s and bringing it all the way up to the end of his life, to sort of capture this period in American history that had never quite been there to my liking.
How did you wind up a co-editor of the papers? It's one thing to write a book, but what made you a part of this much larger project?
Well, I was very, very fortunate. I became friends with Mark Cheatham, who is a professor of history at Cumberland University. And Mark is an eminent Jacksonian scholar who's written several books about the Jacksonian period. And he came to New York to give a talk at Bryant Park. What year was it? It was about maybe a dozen years ago. And we had lunch. And, I said to him, all of the major politicians of this period, what they call the second party system, which is really the sort of antebellum United States. Not only the presidents, but many of the major politicians like Henry Clay and John Calhoun and Daniel Webster. Their papers have all been published, but Van Buren's have not. I mean, they hadn't even been digitized at that stage. They were just languishing on microfilm in a few.
This is relatively recent then. I mean, this
Yes,
is 10, 12 years ago. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So I said to Mark, I said, this is doable because it's not like, the William Seward papers, for example, former governor of New York and the Secretary of State under Lincoln. His papers are at Rochester, and they are in the six figures. Van Buren's papers are about 14, 15,000. So I said to him, with the right staff, we could do this, and we would be filling what I think is an important historical need. And he ran with it. He really ran with it, and he got Cumberland to agree to it. And we assembled a group of scholars, applied for federal funding, and through that federal funding, we were able to get matching grants And we were able to get the Van Buren Papers off the ground. We've now got a website, vanburenpapers.org. It is free to the public. It's a great looking website, very user friendly, and we are adding new material all the time. We've got some letterpress versions also in the pipeline. We have not neglected print.
And so the key when you say you're editing papers these days, is that just organizing them and then making them searchable digitally? Is that the basics of it?
Well, it's everything.
Yeah.
It's the bulk of the work is the transcribing. Uh, it's painstaking, arduous work. It's much more difficult because the digital scans are not always very good. We don't have too many originals. We are always tracking down new ones, by the way. We find them at auction sites. We find them at other repositories and obscure archives and historical societies around the country. Even in Europe, we find them. So we're getting new material all the time. So we transcribe. We also annotate. So when somebody makes reference to another person or an event in a letter, we describe what that is. And then there's the whole process of organizing them in a way that's coherent and user friendly. So people want to look up the War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise, the Tariff of 1824, the Cherokee removal, Van Buren's connection to these things. They can do it. So it's a
And
lot of work. Yeah. But,
and how did they wind up in Tennessee? Is that the Jackson Mark Cheatham
well,
connection?
yes, in short, yes. However, you see papers, they're not always in the most logical place, like the Ulysses S. Grant papers are in Mississippi. Now, of course, Grant has connection to Mississippi, but he's not from there. So, we've got the Andrew Jackson connection, which does make it kind of a logical place. But, in this day and age, the physical home base is really not that important. Everything is going online. Yeah. And so
What
we're
what tools did your journalism career give you that made this a worthwhile thing for you and made you, if I may say, good at this?
You may say that. You say it as much as you like, by the way. Uh, I covered New York politics, and it was extraordinary to me how much things have not changed. That there was the technology has changed, methods of communication have changed, but the human nature has not changed. So I saw the kind of skullduggery that's been part of New York politics. And it's going on right up to this day. Was very much alive in Van Buren's time. And in many ways, he initiated a lot of this stuff. So journalists learn to be dogged and thorough and to dig into as much as you can to try to find the evidence to make your assertions. So all of that helped me with writing this book.
Let's get back to our hero here. Your book opens with a pilgrimage that he makes to Thomas Jefferson.
Mhm.
Martin Van Buren was serving and I hope I get the details right here, but he was serving as a U.S. Senator in 1824. He
Right.
was going to Jefferson to ask for what I would imagine in those days was, well, maybe he didn't even do endorsements in those days, but he wanted an endorsement, which would have been an enormous piece of news and very coveted for a struggling presidential candidate who Van Buren was backing. Why is it so illustrative about why is that episode so illustrative about how Martin Van Buren would change politics?
Oh, there are several reasons why. As you just mentioned, no one went to ex-presidents to try to get them to back their candidate. I mean, this is something done all the time right now. But in Van Buren's time, this was not only a novelty, I mean, it was unheard of. And it was even considered a bit unseemly. Ex-presidents were supposed to retire to their farms and to live out their days as a country gentleman, and you would receive visitors and things like that. And maybe they would mention politics in their letters. But the idea of them taking an active role in a political contest, especially one for the presidency, was really considered verboten. And Van Buren just had zero use for these niceties. He really just thought, do we want to win? Or, do we want to just put on a performance about how virtuous we are? We want to win. And he was all in the 1824 presidential election behind William Harris Crawford, who was a cabinet member in the Monroe administration. And he
Yeah,
was,
I barely heard of him and may not have heard of him.
well, the funny thing was he was the favorite that year, even though who was running with against, who was challenging the nomination? Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun. I mean, these are the giants of 19th century American politics. But Crawford was the front runner that year. Why? Because he had the connections to Congress. The Congressional Caucus is how nominations were done back then. And he had all this experience as a diplomat, as a cabinet member. He was someone who was considered as kind of a Jeffersonian-like figure. And Van Buren was all in on him. And then he has this devastating stroke in 1823. That's much more significant than anybody realized at the time. Van Buren was one of the few who did. He had trouble walking, talking, motor functions. It was something that really set him back. But the word got out that he was unwell, and his campaign was really foundering. So Van Buren decides, we're going to go see Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to bring a few people along with me, including one guy who was jailed during the Alien and Sedition Act, something that Jefferson was very passionate about. He had everything planned out methodically about how he was going to manipulate him to try to get him to just go public and just say a few words about William Harris Crawford, preferably write a letter that would go into maybe the Richmond Inquirer and then would be distributed in other newspapers, Republican newspapers around the country, saying Jefferson endorses Crawford. He saw this as a real coup in the campaign. Well, Jefferson, of course, saw right through him and ignored the issue altogether. But the fact that he even had the audacity to try it tells you a great deal about the kind of person he was.
What lesson did he learn from it?
From the Jefferson meeting?
From him being turned away, did he get dissuaded, or did he say, I've got to try to make this work in other ways in the later parts of my career?
He was never one to dwell on failures. He learned from them, and he moved on. And he learned a great deal about the debacle of 1824, which really could have finished a lesser politician, because he was so committed to Crawford's candidacy. And when he couldn't deliver his own state for Crawford at a minimum, his political stock really plummeted in Washington. And a lot of people who thought, who's this Van Buren wonderkind everyone's talking about? He just did nothing but one flop after another. And from there, Van Buren picked up the pieces. He realized something, that this guy, Andrew Jackson, who I dismissed, and a lot of Republicans dismissed at the time, he has caught on with the American people in ways we didn't recognize and did not appreciate. And that's when he moved toward Andrew Jackson. And that set the stage for the next phase of his career.
The era of good feelings. It sounds so nice.
It does. Those feelings were not so good, trust me.
I was going to ask, politics is almost seldom comfortable and nice, and probably every era thinks that they're living through the worst era.
Right.
What was happening in the country that made America ripe for a party takeover as Van Buren is gaining in power and influence and fame?
The era of good feelings was a term that a Boston newspaper editor coined, and it had to do with the decline in political parties in America. That the Federalist Party, the party of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, it was pretty much finished as a political force after its disastrous showing in the War of 1812. James Monroe is president, and everybody pretty much just calls himself a Republican right now. And everybody's talking about how nice it is that the party bickering that we had under Adams and Jefferson and Madison, all of that had subsided, and we're all working more constructively. You know, Van Buren saw disaster here because he said, we can pretend like there are no parties and no factions, but there are. They're just kind of taking on different names. So any party that can have both John C. Calhoun and John Quincy Adams as members of it is not much of a political party. It's just kind of a name that people are embracing. But what about the principles? What about the issues? So Van Buren comes to Washington in the early 1820s, and he's really determined to inject partisanship back into American politics because he was someone who really argued that these Jeffersonian principles, the idea that the forces of the rich and the powerful, that they're always going to try to have their thumbs on the scale and use government to bend government for their own purposes. That's always going to be here. So we've got this new faction of the Republican Party. They're called National Republicans. And this is what Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, what they gravitate toward. And they want to see the federal government take a stronger role in engineering America's economic life, to build bridges, to build canals, to build roads, to modernize the country and use that as a way of fostering economic development. To Van Buren, he says, all that looks good on paper, but if we're going to have a strong federal government, this is going to swallow up the states, and this is going to bring us back to the 1790s when Alexander Hamilton used the power of the government to crush the Whiskey Rebellion, to have this first bank of the United States that would dominate America's banking and credit and financial system. A lot of it just looks strange from today's perspective, but there was this real fear about how a strong federal government would overwhelm American life. So Van Buren wants to see a more decentralized government, one where the states have a greater role. And he finds partners in the South. And the South, well, they join forces with him, but for very different reasons. They see a strong federal government as one that will threaten their system of slavery. Van Buren can see this. He sees that their interests are much more narrow. At the same time, he just thought building coalitions is how you win in politics. So he forms these alliances with them to fight John Quincy Adams' administration. But these deals he makes with the slaveocracy, to use John Quincy Adams' term, he does one after another, and they become an essential part of what becomes his party, the Democratic Party. And this has very ominous consequences in America.
He is, if you look at him through the lens of someone who's trying to end slavery in America, did Van Buren become a villain to them?
Yes. Van Buren, the North sees him as somebody, as a sellout, and somebody who is not only selling out their region in regards to slavery, but a host of other issues. So many people are bringing up this issue of the North. We are the engine of prosperity in America. New York is the largest state in the Union by far. Van Buren is from New York. And then there's Pennsylvania, and there's Massachusetts. And they really see the North as where the universities are, where Wall Street and Chestnut Street, that's Philadelphia's area of finance, that these are the areas where we're seeing genuine prosperity in America. And this is the future of America. You know, it's not the slave-dependent industries, which are not only morally disastrous, but are going to have economic consequences for the nation as well. So Van Buren's constant kowtowing to the slaveocracy makes him increasingly unpopular in the North, to when he loses his re-election in 1840, he gets crushed in the North, and he even loses his home state of New York.
I wanted to ask about the Panic of 1837. That is a depression. It lasts for several years. What was his approach to dealing with that as president? Was politics useful to him at that moment?
Well, the Panic of 1837, and we use this term because people really were panicking. They were going to the banks to try to make withdrawals to get specie, was to get cash, to get coins. But banks had run out of coins because Andrew Jackson's economic policies have drained the banks of all their specie, because Jackson really wanted to encourage less cash, more coins, to the point where he would say, okay, if you want to buy any federal lands, you can only do it with specie, gold and silver. Banks were running out of this stuff. People had nothing to go to. When the panic started, which was triggered by events in Britain, came to the United States, it was kind of a worldwide depression. And Van Buren's tools for dealing with this were very minimal. And furthermore, economics was just not really his strong suit. So we had this strange system of banking back then. Andrew Jackson crushed the second bank of the United States. We call it the bank war now. He didn't want the bank being used as a depository for federal funds because it was a private bank with shareholders, and Jackson was very much opposed to this. Van Buren less so, but he kind of went along with it. It wasn't quite the Federal Reserve, the Bank of the United States, but it had some similar characteristics. It was there to be a stabilizing effect on the currency, on the nation's finances, and it was gone. So where are we depositing our money? In private state banks all over the country. Van Buren could see that this was a real force for instability in this country. So he came up with this idea for what he called the independent treasury. It would just be an institution where federal funds would go to, would not be a bank, would not be involved in any kind of speculative schemes, would not be answerable to shareholders in any way. It would just be a vault to put federal revenues. Problem was, it's not a terribly exciting idea. People say, well, that's nice, but what's going to offer people in the forms of relief? Because people are really hurting right now. They are without cash, and they need cash to buy goods and services. So he really didn't have much of an answer to this. And at the time, we were going through kind of an important shift because the previous economic recession, term didn't exist back then, but it was called the Panic of 1819. And that was pretty severe as well. But the next year, James Monroe was reelected president almost unanimously. He won every electoral vote in the country save one. So there was this idea that presidents aren't really held responsible for the state of the economy. But things were changing in the late 1830s when Van Buren was president, because a lot of people, the party system had greater repercussions throughout the country. And there was this belief that Jackson's policies brought them to where they were. So he was responsible, and he didn't have much of an answer. So it was one of the reasons why his presidency never really got off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, and as you mentioned, his presidency kind of fizzles out, and I'm looking at it now. Between Van Buren and Lincoln, no presidents won a second term. Some of them died, but no president served a second term.
And some didn't even get nominated for a second term.
Yeah,
Didn't get born again.
So I'm wondering, did his political creation, even though we still live under it, was that a legacy that was immediately kind of, set in stone here? That his
no, not at all. And
I guess, in other words, the question is, he there were a number of weak presidents, probably other than Polk. There were a number of weak presidents that came after him.
Polk was not a weak president. I mean, say what you want about him,
Yeah, that's my point. I mean, other than Polk, many weak presidents after him, between Van Buren and Lincoln, is that his legacy, that what he created was not strong enough to make presidents last in the eyes of the Republic.
Well, let me tell you, when he was on his deathbed, I'm sure that's what he was thinking. The nation, he dies in 1862. The nation is in the midst of a civil war. It's going very badly for the North. It would turn around a few months after he died with the Battle of Antietam. But in July of 1862, the South was winning. Things were looking very bleak for the North. His Democratic Party in the South, all of them joined the Confederacy en masse. There's one exception, Andrew Johnson. So from his perspective, and what was his legacy? Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, these were terrible presidents. So he didn't realize this. Things looked like he was looking like his Democratic Party really didn't have any future. It was unclear whether his country had any future. But now we know the Democratic Party survived, the nation survived. And, Van Burenism in some way really did survive until the late 19th century. One of his proteges was a guy named Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York, who ran against Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. And you could do a podcast one day about the election of 1876 because Tilden won. He won the popular vote. He won the electoral vote. And through thoroughly corrupt means, the election was taken from him and handed to Rutherford B. Hayes, which ended Reconstruction, ushered in a period of segregation and democratic rule. It's an extraordinary story, but what if Tilden had won that election and he had become president? So Van Burenism really was alive as a political force well into the late 19th century.
Was Lincoln on the record about Van Buren? For instance, when he died, did he say anything? Are there any writings about
Yep,
that
yep.
Lincoln said it? What did he think of him?
He made a public, well, he did what a lot of presidents do when a predecessor dies. He issued a public statement. He praised Van Buren for his commitments to the country. He ordered federal agencies closed for the day, and he had Union soldiers. They wore black armbands for about 6 months, but obviously he had bigger things to worry about than Martin Van Buren. So it was something. He did the gestures that presidents do, but he did meet Van Buren. He met him in 1842, and he liked him, and Van Buren liked him. They got along well personally, but yeah, obviously politically they went in very different directions.
Did the Van Buren presidency prove that he was right or wrong about the forces that parties could unleash? This idea that they could organize versus the idea that they would be corrupting.
He wrote a lot about this, and he wrote about parties saying, of course, a political party can be corrupt. Anything can be corrupt. He said the solution is not to get rid of political parties, but to run them with more efficiency, with honesty, to have them integrated more with state political parties, local political parties. So he really believed in the party. I mean, he wrote a whole book about political parties, and he said, and he was writing it at a time when the whole system was largely under attack, and a lot of people thought, where have parties gotten us to the brink of civil war? And Van Buren said, no, no, no. Parties can be forces for corruption, but they can be forces for positive, good government as well. It's up to us to run them. A party doesn't have any power in and of itself. It's just the people and how the people run it. That's what will determine its success. And that was something he was always trumpeting until his final days.
I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, but I've got to ask it. What would he see in today's political system and today's ranker?
In many ways, I think he would like he would like the way America has turned out. There's this passionate partisanship, which was there in his day. It was just obviously done in different forms. But you know, when you look at a newspaper, say from the 1830s and 40s, they would take snippets from other newspapers across the country. It's almost like Drudge Report or something like that, having snippets of other columns and things like that. So the world of Substack and blogs and things like that, and television stations, one devoted to one party and one devoted to another, he would all think that's a good sign of having politics integrated with the larger country. At the same time, this level of partisanship would be way too extreme for him. He thought the political agitation should be on the local level. He thought the House of Representatives, that's where the real rancor should be. But at the end of the day, it's the Senate. The US Senate is where kind of the grown-ups come together, sit into a room, hammer out an agreement, get the president to go along with it. Now we see the US Senate as every bit as venomous as the House and so many other state legislatures around the country. He would be very much opposed to this. The incumbent president of the United States is someone he would have been horrified by. I'm very confident in saying this. He had this very strong feeling about whatever your political differences, people have got to be civil. People have got to work together. People have got to compromise. People have got to negotiate. And a president should rise above this, some of the fiery parts of politics and lead by example, which is something we just don't see anymore. So parts he would like, parts he wouldn't like. I think overall he would be very dismayed by the state of the nation right now.
If there were a memorial or an exhibit to Martin Van Buren somewhere, and let's say you could design it, what would it be to, and what would it look like to best educate the public about his legacy?
Funny you should say this because it's something I actually dream about in my spare time.
You really are a Van B boy, huh?
I am. I would want to build a tavern. a
Oh,
tavern where the best alcohol is served, where the finest food is served, and which gave a demonstration of politics at the most local level and how your neighborhood pub could be the center for political activity and how that could serve as a model for other political activities. So I would really like something like that to show how politics and fun can be merged together like that as a sign of the sort of political organizing he was responsible for.
and you got to have his face or a statue or something right there in front, right?
Yes. How would I do that? That part I haven't thought about, Evan. I have to work on that.
Well, I'm
Maybe a
not a sculptor.
sculpture somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not a sculptor, but I know the name for it. It's obviously Van Buren's, right?
Van Buren's, the Red Foxes. He had so many nicknames. We could find one way to work a nickname in there.
Your book is dedicated to Melanie. I'm curious who Melanie is and why you made that dedication.
Oh, Melanie is my wife and my best friend and my companion and somebody who made a lot of sacrifices during the writing of this book, where I was holed up in my office for many, many hours, usually shouting for quiet, telling her to get the cats out of here. Uh, she went to a lot of family engagements that I was fortunate enough to get out of because I just kept saying, sorry, I have a book to write. So she had to go and represent me. And there are been a lot of vacations we put off so I could finish this book. So I'm very grateful to have her in my life. And I'm very grateful that she's been so wonderful and accommodating
Do you know
throughout
what
the process.
do you know what you're going to be working on next? Is there a Van Buren project in the offing, or are you going to do something else?
Well, I'm still working on the Van Buren Papers. That is an ongoing project right now, even though, like a lot of documentary editing projects, we have been threatened with federal funding cuts. So we're a bit up in the air right now. It's a tense situation, but we are determined to see this through. We're working on some print editions to get that done. Uh, I'm doing something very different, Evan. I'm writing a book about a political theorist and educator named Thomas Cooper, who was an English emigre, came to the United States in the 1790s. He was a critic of the slave trade in England. He was a proponent of the French Revolution, and he comes to America, moves down south, becomes president of South Carolina College, and he becomes an apologist for slavery and secession and nullification. It's like the intellectual godfather of this. So I think he plays this big role in how the nation was split and divided. It's a story that really hasn't been told so far. So it's going to be a short book. And so far, it's been really fascinating and exciting. And I'll do another presidential biography. We'll see how that turns out. But for now, I'm writing.
Am I allowed to ask for a hint?
No, all right, I'll give you a hint. His initials are AJ. I'm not saying any more than that.
All right, there's a few options there. James Bradley, the author of Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan. My pleasure.
Check out the book and also the website of the Martin Van Buren Papers, which is at vanburenpapers.org. AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.